Logan, do you need me to split it into 2 parts? Just leave it. Do you need me to split it into?
Ladies and gentlemen, Robin comes up here and dares us to say that France has no democracy. Right, but when my burqa-wearing sisters are dragged off the street of France for inherently trying to practice their right and religion because the indoctrination of the system there tells people that my religion is extremist, I think that that's a big problem. Just because you vote for the government does not necessarily mean that dissenting ideas can exist within that system. And this is essentially what we on the side of the government have been running about. The fact that public education system creates a big institution that socially conditions the people to shape and move the way their society wants. And we think that that's a problem. We also think that public education system has failed, generally because the government are a poor service provider. So let's look at the first point of clash in this debate. One, how does it affect the poor? The second point of clash I will deal with is what Robin has talked about, the loss of the inherent public good. And let's deal with the first one. Their biggest argument here is that the poor can't afford private education. The poor won't be able to do as well when you don't have a form of standardized system. Well, let's deal with the first idea. The argument that Take brought up is that private education will inherently still be expensive because but the problem here is that because you have to compete with a free education system. So thus, the market that they deal with is a small and exclusive group. So obviously, they stay expensive. Now, when you take that away, in any kind of business measure, what you see is that the attraction in order to conquer the market means that you provide cheap and affordable services with better products. And that's just the law of how the market works. They haven't dealt with that. In the same breath, they tell us that private education will actually get worse and have no incentive because, they won't have to compete with the competition of the public education system, which I think is complete nonsense. Because what you have to do in private education right now is just to be better than the public education system. That's all you really need. But when you take that away, you have competition amongst the private education system in themselves. That means there is a necessity for them to up the other and to continue being better and to provide affordable and accessible education in order for you to succeed in the market. So Takenori's argument is complete nonsense. Now let's look at the second idea. This big idea that they keep pushing that, poor people will not be able to have education. The problem that you see in society today is that the gap between the rich and the poor has widened. I dare you to tell me that that's not happening. What you see is a singular standard where everyone is expected to succeed and the poor will continue to fail because the rich and the middle class have the capacity to have a complementary system on top of the public education system that you have together. You are asking everyone to compete on the same running field when some people have shoes and some people are running barefooted. You are assessing whether or not fishes are geniuses by trying to see if they can climb trees. I've always wanted to use that quote, so it's great. Now you see the problem here is that this gap grows because there is no difference in the provision of the education. What you have is one big system that everyone has to succeed in, and you have a group of people who have other things that they can use in order to continue to succeed. And that's why public education system has always been or has always failed in a lot of places. Now Robin comes up here and says that Germany, Finland and France have great public education system and most of the time it's a problem of resources. Now that's exactly the problem, isn't it? All these other countries won't be changing the capacity of resource that they have. France and Finland and Germany have that extra, capacity of resources, which is great. But in places like America, in places like Southeast Asia, these countries will not have the same kind or the amount of resources will not reach as far as we would like to do, which is why our system has come into place. And they only talked about the school coupon system. They've never dealt with what Logan has talked about. He's talked about tax exemption to institutes that want to set up school system. He talked about funding to institutions that do want to set up systems, and what you have to prove is a minimum standard and base of where and what the school is. So NC also talked about how society-driven education is more apt to blossom because people have the capacity, or communities have the capacity, to now decide the kind of education system that they want to develop, and they are more likely to put in the donation. Like for example, churches have more capacity to do so within their community. Small groups and community who have different ideas and want to develop their form of education are more likely to put in the money, as opposed to public education system with whom they might not agree in the ideas with. Before I move on, yes, Robin.
If your side posits there's no one-size-fits-all conception of the public good, then why are you guys okay with minimum accreditation and anti-discrimination laws, which are objective conceptions of the public good?
Because that's not a wholesale form of testing on what and where you are. If you have minimum accreditation, because for example, lawyers, that's one singular profession. You know, doctors, that's one singular profession. Engineers, that's one singular profession. But as opposed to a national exam where everyone takes the same exam, that's completely different. So let's move on to the second argument, where Robin says there's a loss of inherent public good, and history and civic service is not given any attention in the public school. But that's exactly what Logan was arguing about, that it becomes a choice of indoctrination. Because, for example, in the United States public education system, black history, native history, minority history, all of it becomes whitewashed into a singular government-driven, government-benefit education system. You look at the Chinese education system, you look at the Korean education system, you look at the Malaysian education system, history becomes altered to the winning man's history. Public service and civil service becomes altered to the winning man's idea of what the government should be about. Just because you don't have public schools doesn't mean schools won't teach education. Before the integration of schools in the United States, black schools used to teach black pride history. They had more focus on the kind of community history that they have. So what if Oklahoma doesn't want to teach about evolution? Because right now in public schools throughout the US, you don't have the right to teach evolution either. So now at least you have schools that want to teach evolution, you have schools that want to teach intelligent design, then you balance each other out as opposed to one singular idea. You talk about arts being lost because now only science and engineering will become the focus. And yet you see today's public education system focus mostly on these subjects, and arts are being lost. The arts are developed in the private education system because these people have the interest to it. Now you take away public education system, you have more people to garner interest, and you have better competition among art schools in order for these to develop. You open the market. So at the end of the day, what we see, Mr. Speaker, is that public education has done more harm than good. Thank you.
Right, we thank the previous and I invite the opposition.
What affirmative began with in this debate is essentially what every bum wants to hear. That it's okay not to go to school because it's not all that great anyway. But they're probably correct that there are many problems with the public education system. That it's not guaranteed you're going to become a great student or you're going to learn how to count if you go to a good or to a bad public school. But what I can guarantee you, children, is that if you don't go to school, it is guaranteed you will not learn to count. At least under our model, it's only a chance, ladies and gentlemen, that this is going to happen. But more than that, that's already at worst. At best, the chance of you ending up in a bad private school is just the same under their model. Because by the way, they will also exist. Because if there are private schools who don't need state subsidy to exist because they have rich donors that NC was talking about, they can still exist under their model and they will still have students who will end up with bad education, right? That's why debates aren't just won by pointing out that there is a problem with the public education system. You need to have been able to explicate why the private education system is not susceptible to the particular problems that they were trying to point out with the public schools that we were talking about. And there are two questions we want to answer to resolve the debate. The first is this: where is better education really more likely to be present? Because on the first level, Logan wants to talk to us about values. And he said, look, health, PE, art, values. They're just all politicized things that have nothing to do with basic education, and you shouldn't be teaching them. You shouldn't be allowing states to shape you and manipulate you. And just because it's said in a scary way doesn't mean it actually is, guys. There are 4 responses to this. First is this. It doesn't have anything to do with basic education, but it does have a lot to do with holistic education. Because without people knowing how to take care of their health, how to exercise, then you're effectively not going to be able to make use of your skill to do math or to do science if you're eventually just going to keep getting sick and not being able to run. And yes, there may be many ways to be able to measure subjects because it's not a single profession per se like law, but it is a single occupation, being a student. And there are ways to measure it per subject, even if there aren't ways to measure it as a whole and in general. But the second response is this. Who is to say that these aren't basic things and that they're only politicized? Because if I want to become an athlete at 18, I cannot only start exercising and knowing how to, do exercise stuff when I'm already 18. Essentially, they're missing the point of public and primary and secondary education. That it isn't for you to learn only a specialization from the onset. It's supposed to be laying out the foundation so that when you are susceptible to making good choices, every possible option is available to you. And that's only ever going to be possible if the state gets to lay out the things that you should be learning as a child. That's why it's okay that the state is doing that. But third, it's not even as if under their model, even assuming that, having a baseline things of teaching you is bad, it's not as if it's not going to happen under their model. In fact, it's more likely to happen in theirs. Because at least on our side, on their side, if Catholic schools who have absolutely no form of state subsidy, because a single brick in the Vatican can probably fund 10 of them, you know that they will be teaching you more moral values than any Singaporean public school ever can, ladies and gentlemen. That's why if you look at it, these children don't have a choice but to learn values even in the private schools that they want to be teaching. And if you look at the model comparison, it's this. The value and politicization that we have under public schools in our model can only go as far as society will agree to it. That society will have a natural disincentive and a natural way of having public discourse because politicians are accountable to them. And for them to stay in power, they need to be agreeable to the people. But under their model, if you're a Catholic school who is receiving absolutely no state subsidy, what is the choice of a poor person who only has access to one school in their community, but to access that type of education, those types of values, and that type of politicization? Essentially, the optionless child and the optionless Muslim that Lynn wants to talk about is even poorer under their model. Because in our chance, at least there's a natural check and balance of elected officials needing to be agreeable to the general public. But under their side, there's absolutely no guarantee that private schools will ever want to adjust to the people who will get into their school. But here's the second thing. Anthony also talked about money in this very small case. And he told you, look, community donations will make schools better, and it's more likely to increase on their side because if I were rich, I don't want to donate to a public school. Why not? Why wouldn't you want to donate in a public school? He never told us why. In fact, if you truly look at it, as an altruistic person, if I really do want to help out, and public schools are bad, isn't more convenient and isn't more intuitive that I would want to donate to the poorer public schools so that they can improve because I want to help out, and that's the only reason why I'm giving away my money. But second of all, it doesn't even matter, even assuming that people aren't going to donate in our model, because in our model, we have what we call taxes, and they're mandatory, and people have no choice but to give them to the public education system, and if we want to increase the budget, then we can just increase taxes as well. That's why those types of donations aren't even necessary in this debate. What did we tell you about why education is more likely to be better on our side? It's the unrebutted case of Robin, ladies and gentlemen, when we told you that democratic accountability is highly likely to improve public education because when they are bad, people do clamor for public education to be good. But second of all, Robin's unrebutted case that under their model is more likely to be a lottery. That private schools will still likely have a finite number of those which are good private schools, and only certain specific individuals will get to access those schools, and you leave the rest of them to crappy private schools with no other recourse but to stay there. That's why we think, ladies and gentlemen, that better private education or better education in general is more likely to occur on our models. What's the second issue? The second issue we need to ask, where is access to education really going to be found? Because NC reduces Robin's POI and says, look, not all public schools and not all private schools are going to be racist, discriminatory, or Catholic, which is true. But if you look at at it, the uniqueness of schools as a public good is the fact that they are geographically locked. Just because your school there is racist doesn't mean that if you don't like them and they won't accept you, you can simply move states or move communities to be able to access another type of school. It's not that easy. People have work, your parents will have to stay in this particular area, and they cannot just move if they are rejected. That's why we think, ladies and gentlemen, that usually in those communities which operate in a Pueblo style, which means they only have 1 to 2 schools per area, they have no option but to stay there and receive the type of politicized education that a private school will want to give them. But second of all, if we really are concerned about NC and minorities and going bottom up, if you look at it, the only way that minorities ever get to go up the social ladder and be mobile is if they receive a good type of education. And the way you do that is not to improve only specific number of schools who do that because of competition, but to improve the public system in general, increase taxes and allow them to develop so that everyone all together can receive good education and allow themselves to access it. That's why we think, ladies and gentlemen, that education cannot remain a privilege and it must remain a right. Thank you.
Thank Rivas to wrap up opposition's case. Opposition reply.
The key problem of that side of the house is that they took one singular problem within certain geographical locations, that is, failing public schools in inner cities in places like the United States, and transpose it to the entirety of the world, ignoring the nuances and the weight of history that says that the vast majority of countries with the best educational outcomes in the world, regarding any metrics you might use, math, science, arts, countries like Finland, like France, like Singapore even, all have public schools. So, the majority of these populations actually go to public schools. And the key failure of that side is their failure to deal with circumstances and examples that do not benefit them. And that has been their problem. I'm going to look at a few things in this debate. The first is their assertion that the government is just not a good provider of the public good. Now, when Logan said this as opening gambit, intuitively, that is just not true. Government provides all sorts of things. They provide you with water, transport, the very roads that you use to get to ADI today. So the problem here is the question that you ask is that are good public schools fundamentally impossible? Is there something inherent about government that means that they cannot provide good education? And our argument from the get-go is that that's just simply not true. For the simple fact that most countries, most of the best countries in the world, the best educational outcomes, have public schools. Then they say that's only because they have resources. To which Val very eloquently replied that increase taxes so that America can have more resources as well, so they can have good public schools as well. Never engaged with the other side of the house. But more than that, they've never engaged with the bulk of our analysis. There's a whole bunch of other reforms other than resources that they never dealt with. Even in places like the United States, collective bargaining power of particularly pernicious teachers' unions are being taken away as well. Issues of pedagogy are gradually changing in all these countries as well. And we think that as long as they failed to prove that there's something inherently wrong with government, they've already lost this debate. This then brings me on to the second issue, the idea of the public good. Once again, they started out with bold philosophical claim that there's no such thing as the public good, that the public good is determined by communities and individuals as well. Then they contradicted their stance by saying, no, there are some things that are the public good. That's why we can have anti-discrimination law. Which means that at third speaker, they then shifted their entire case to say, no, this debate is actually about minorities who are discriminated against in a one-size-fits-all system. To which we have also given you a variety of responses. Some things are objective goods. If you are a French Muslim, it is an objective good that you need to learn French in order to have upward social mobility. Something I talked about in my speech as well. The only way an Algerian Muslim in France can actually participate in economic and political life and advance their community is to learn French, is to participate in the political process, is for public schools to lay the foundation of the possibilities that you can take later on in your life through a broad-based public school curriculum. And the weight of evidence, once again, is not on their side. That is the nuance here that they've never engaged with. And in their world, they're creating a world whereby community schools like madrasas, like ethnic schools, will be the sole dominating presence in the education of these kids. This sounds like separate but equal to me. This sounds like inherent discrimination, but these individuals never have opportunity simply because of where they're born and the communities they're born in. Then we talk about access. They simply asserted that no, everyone with access. That's not our point. It's about access to good education. And that is where the logic in my case became especially important. The fact is only a small number of poor people can go to your best private schools because that supply is finite. In their case, they do not even have the safety blanket of a public school for these individuals as well. That is why we think on the comparative, their policy makes things worse. Then the last thing we talked about here is private education. Is it necessarily as awesome as they say? And here, once again, they've never dealt what we have said. We agree that there will be a variety. But in the communities we're talking about here, the institutions with the most organizational power to create a stranglehold over these communities are your religious churches, are likely to be the regressive institutions that will teach you that the world is only 6,000 years old. To which Lin then replied, it's okay if some schools want to teach you the world is only 6,000 years old. That's their community's choice. And when they say that, you know they've already lost this debate. Ladies and gentlemen, we think there are certain things that are public goods, that are objective goods. And individuals, particularly the disenfranchised, require this in order to advance themselves and in order to actualize their full potential. That is why opposition is immensely proud to oppose.
Right. Next previous, close the debate. Government reply.
We think opposition has been a little bit selective in dealing with our case, right? They want to say that only some public schools are really bad, actually. So don't paint all the public schools as a problem. It's really only very few public schools. But to those of us who go to public schools on a regular basis, we know that's not really the issue. On the other hand, they say, hey, when you start doing community-driven private education, they're all going to teach kids crazy shit. And they're all going to be like nut jobs, right? So that's what, realistically, we know that the truth is somewhere in between. That there's a large number of public schools are failing, and if we give it to community-driven schools, some of them are going to teach things that you disagree with, but we think that that's what the community should have choices over. And that comes down to one of the big questions. So what is the choice? Who should be able to make these choices? We distrust big government. We don't think that when you put, and this is the question I asked, and I would have tried to ask Val if she took me, that is, where is the incentive of these governments to create more diversity? Right? The governments want to keep themselves in power. They're not essentially just bad, it's just that any large state organization always models the future in its own eyes. So the question is not whether you teach history or don't teach history. We think history is important, but what kind of history you're teaching, and what choices that you're making when you're teaching that history, and who gets to print all those textbooks, and who decides what an A in that history means, and why it's important, like all of those things. And it's not just about the people who can't get it. And that's also interesting too. So what about all these poor people who can't get access to education? You guys don't want poor, you don't like poor people. We do. We love poor people. We are poor people. But if that's the case, help poor people. Why work it out so that 90% of people get this public education? It's like the question with food. If some people can't eat, Robin's right, have soup kitchens. Or help people, give people who can't eat food. But you don't have governments providing food to everyone. Hey, food's a lot more important than whether you can count, right? So why don't governments provide food to everyone to make sure all of you can eat? Because they'll make bad food choices. Because they'll decide what kind of food you can eat. I don't want to eat ramen. And then Kip's right. Some people will just want to eat French fries and only eat French fries. And we say, yeah, maybe they should be allowed to just eat French fries. Because you need the community and the parents' impact in that anyway. And that's the tricky part about education. Because just because you put a child in a classroom doesn't mean that child is learning. And if the people in that community, the parents aren't tied into the education, don't mean that they are learning, right? And again with the food example, they say, oh no, but then you can't set standards and you backtrack. And if you set standards, then you're contradicting yourselves. No, we didn't. I said, and I gave this food example. You can say how clean a restaurant is. You can say who can enter the restaurant, who can't enter the restaurant, right? You can do those things, but you can't tell them what they should serve, all right? And that's what they want to do. And that's the fundamental difference of this debate. We said there were three huge problems. There's indoctrination from the state. The state is creating people and telling them things that they don't need to do. Why are you telling people what they need to eat? Just, right? Just let them, help them eat, but that's all you need to do. Secondly, we said the state's doing a bad job at it. And it's not just a quality question. In principle, because the state has so much vested interest, they can't seem to fail. They can't give it up. They can't change it because it's so huge. Because like Val's right, there's all these schools in all these places and you don't have a choice. I have to go to my state school and it's there. And that's what makes it much harder for the private education. And third, we talked about how community-driven education can be better. Instead of putting all that money into all these schools, to all these teachers which you really can't fire, break it up. Let people start doing all these different things. And we told you how that's going to become cheaper. How that people are going to drive and take more interest into it. Because now, that's my education, things that I have control over. And you're just going to help me do it. So it may sound a little bit crazy to say like, oh, public education's not doing its job. But the truth is, it isn't. And the scary truth is, it's doing a lot more things to you than you know. Why are kids learning all these things? And once you learn them, you can't unlearn them. It's a very, very powerful power that the state has. And we're only giving them more power. It's really scary. But also scarier when I say it in a scary way. Thank you very much.
Let's give them a round of applause. Yeah.